Hi everybody. Tonight, we begin a quiet descent into the world of ancient Rome, not from the polished marble floors of the Senate or the golden halls of emperors, but from the dust and silence that cloak the camps of the Roman legions. This story isn't about grand battles or glorious triumphs. It's about the daily breath of a legionary, the weight of the helmet, the crack of the centurion's vine stick, the silence of cold nights with only iron for warmth. You've likely heard of the strength of Rome, but what if you, just as you are now, stepped back into that world? This is the story of why you wouldn't last a single day in the Roman Legion, and what that means for the rest of us. Let us begin. The dawn broke not with sunlight but with orders. Before the edge of light graced the hills of Hispania, the horns had already stirred the camp. A man named Gaius stood from his cot, a thin layer of straw his only cushion. His body, though not yet old, bore the wear of 10 campaigns. His knuckles were thick, scarred. His right knee had learned to ache in the rains. But none of these pains showed on his face. For Gaius, there was only one thing worse than pain: hesitation. That was what got you the cane. If you were there, if you had woken that same hour, you might not have known what to do first. There were no mirrors, no soft towels, no privacy, just a dark chill and the grumbling shuffle of 100 other men waking beside you. You'd be expected to rise, dress, and secure your belt and armor before the second blast of the horn. Not because anyone told you to, but because you had watched, listened, and learned fast enough to avoid punishment. The air carried a wetness that clung to the bones, but firewood was rationed, and the scent of smoke was rare. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was a meager helping of barley soaked in vinegar water. There was no talking, not because it was forbidden, but because there was no strength left to waste on words. Around you, the camp was a world unto itself. Everything had its place. The latrines were dug deep and far from the tents, surrounded by thorn brush to keep animals and unwanted company away. Water was fetched from the nearest stream, one assigned man at a time, shield on back, sword never out of reach. Even in routine, danger lingered just outside the wooden palisade. You, a newcomer, would be assigned the lowest duties. You would not march that day. You would clean. You would gather dung from the cavalry horses and smooth it into the mud floors to keep them dry. You would scrub your armor and then someone else's. If the centurion saw you idling, you'd receive a sharp word, or worse, the vine stick that hung always at his side, never far from his hand. But Gaius, he would march. When the horn sounded the third time, the optio called out names in the coarse Latin that even Gauls had learned to understand. Gaius, heavy with gear, joined the column without question. 45 pounds of armor, shield, weapons, rations. Add to that the weight of silence. The march was not a swift one. It was a test of patience, of rhythm. You were to keep step or be shoved, fall behind, and you risked punishment at the next stop. The roads were often unpaved, the boots made of raw hide, the stones sharp, the dust thick. Even if you made it through the first hour, by the second your back would burn and your feet would protest with every step. A blister would form. You would think surely there would be a stop for water. But the legions trained not for comfort, but for conquest. You drank when you were told to. You stopped only when the signal allowed. Every part of you would ache before the midday rest, and yet that would be only half the day. As the sun reached its peak, the centurion halted the march, not to rest but to build. Each night the legionaries built their own camp, a small fortress, complete with ditches, stakes, palisade walls. Every man had a tool, and every hand was expected to dig. There was no rest after marching, no sleep until the work was done. This was how the Romans moved, carrying their empire on their backs. You might think you'd rest then, that after the trench, the stakes, the fire watch assignments, you'd be given peace. But night brought its own trials. Sleep came late and left early. Each man stood guard in turns, hours at a time, while the others tried to rest. A single mistake, a missed sound, a neglected shadow, could cost lives. And so the weight of fear joined the weight of iron. You wouldn't just be tired, you'd be hunted by your own mind. Gaius, even after all these years, still had his rituals. He would sharpen his gladius in silence. Not to keep it sharp, it had long since passed that need, but to pass the time, to steady his thoughts, to remember the names of men who had fallen when others had failed to keep watch. When his turn at the palisade came, he did not speak. He watched the dark as though it were a second skin. No sound escaped him. No movement passed unnoticed. He was part of the night itself, forged not from heroism, but repetition. Pain, fear, endurance. You, on the other hand, might find yourself longing for sleep, only to find none. And if you thought the morning would come gently, it wouldn't. It came with another horn, and another day, another march, another camp to build. The days blurred together like this, not out of monotony, but out of survival. The mind learned to forget what was unbearable. The heart hardened, not from malice, but from necessity. And still, even among the discipline and the dust, there were moments, a shared glance, a joke whispered in Greek, a small coin found in the dirt, that reminded Gaius of the city he hadn't seen in 5 winters. You wouldn't last a day, not because you're weak, but because your world, our world, is not built for this life. It was not built for iron. Hi everybody. Last time we awoke beside Gaius in the cold dark of the Legion's camp, learned how a day began not with light but with labor, and followed the relentless rhythm of a life carried on the back in silence and in dust. Tonight, we continue from that same moment, the end of a long night and the first breath of the next grueling day. The morning did not begin. It simply resumed. No songbirds marked the hour, for the camp was far from gardens, far from orchards and music and market women calling over piles of plums. The world here was stripped of comfort. Instead, there was the low groan of aching limbs and the quiet, rhythmic snapping of blankets being folded. Gaius sat on a low stool, shoulders hunched, pressing leather straps tight around his calves. His armor hung nearby, not polished but serviceable. You might have looked for a moment to gather yourself, perhaps even to yawn, but the camp did not forgive delay. The moment the horn sounded, every motion became expectation. Slack hands were punished. Hesitating eyes earned suspicion, and suspicion in the Roman ranks spread fast and bit hard. Outside, a thin layer of fog clung to the earth. It softened outlines and painted the world in pale silver. But to the Legion, it meant danger. Visibility was low. Ambushes bred best in fog. So orders were spoken not with urgency, but with the quiet force of men who knew what they risked. Gaius lifted his shield, its curve familiar against his side. The leather had cracked in places. It bore old paint, worn red with the faint ghost of a golden boar. His gladius, short and reliable, was already fastened beneath his belt. This morning, like all others, would be made of repetition. And yet, as the men gathered in formation beyond the tents, a change hovered. The tribune had arrived. He was young, far too young, Gaius thought, not yet lined by weather or time, with polished greaves and a spotless cloak. His arrival sent murmurs through the ranks, though no one turned to speak. Instead, Gaius only narrowed his eyes. A tribune meant orders from further up the chain. A tribune meant movement. They were no longer training. They were being sent. The centurion, his voice sharp and grizzled, barked the announcement. A border settlement had gone quiet. No messages for 3 weeks. The locals were known for unrest. The possibility of revolt was low, but protocol was protocol. A detachment of 80 would march east. You would not be asked if you were ready. You would not be consulted. You were a body in the line. And you, a newcomer, might not yet realize what this meant. A recon march could last days. It meant rationed bread and vinegar water, cold beds without fire, and the constant grip of uncertainty. Would the settlement be empty? Burned? Would they find signs of resistance, of ambush, of betrayal? Or perhaps, just perhaps, they'd find nothing. But no legionary trusted that kind of luck. You would be placed toward the rear of the column, near the pack mules and supply carts, under the watch of a grim-faced tesserarius who kept new recruits from wandering too far from their ranks. The mules bore salt, dried meat, extra pila, short spears designed not for repeated throws, but for singular purpose, to bend upon impact so the enemy could not return them. The column moved with dreadful calm. They crossed a narrow river by footbridge, the water biting cold. The sandals, thin-soled and laced to mid-shin, were always wet, and in that dampness infection waited. There were no salves on hand, no balm, only cloth to wrap a wound if lucky, and a prayer whispered to Mars if not. By midday, the sun broke through the fog. The earth warmed just enough to send a haze rising from the stones. The path narrowed, winding between 2 ridges, thick with underbrush. There, every man's hand drew closer to his sword. Gaius scanned the ridges, always watching the ridges. You would be tempted to look at the sky, to ease your shoulders, to blink away the sweat that ran into your eyes. But not Gaius. He never blinked when the path narrowed. No ambush came. Not today. That night they did not build a full camp. There wasn't time. Instead, the column stopped in a clearing, and the centurion barked for a marching camp. A minimal version of their usual defenses. Ditches shallow, stakes fewer. Enough to deter animals, not men. Gaius ate beside the fireless hearth, his eyes already on the eastern path. A strip of hard cheese and barley paste, cold, dry, filling only in the most mechanical sense. The stars above were bright and indifferent. Your legs would throb, your feet might bleed. You would find no comfort, only the hollow reward of obedience. And still, the hardest part had not yet begun. As darkness settled, the optio came with the watch assignments. Gaius would take second watch. You would take fourth. It meant waking in the blackest hour, just before dawn, when dreams are strongest and limbs most reluctant. You would be shaken awake by another legionary, one who gave no words, only a nod. The night air would pierce your lungs. The darkness would feel alive. You would step outside the tent, sword at your side, and take your place beside a crude wooden post. You were to watch the tree line, not move, not speak, not even shift your weight too often. And in that stillness, the mind would turn. It would wander back to your home, your street, your childhood smells. Fresh bread, morning rain, the warmth of a blanket. All of it would rise like smoke in your memory, and none of it could follow you here. This was the quietest part of the legionary's day, and yet for many, it was the loudest. You would hear twigs snap and convince yourself it was nothing. You would hear owls and think of ghosts, and if you fell asleep, even for a breath, you would risk the lash, or worse. Gaius would not sleep easy that night, not because he feared, but because he remembered. His last recon march had ended with fire. He had carried a friend back from the ashes, wrapped in his own cloak, too late to save. That memory would never leave him. And so, as you stood trembling in the fourth watch, unsure whether the sounds in the trees were foxes or foes, Gaius sat nearby, eyes half closed, murmuring the name of the man he'd lost. The Legion didn't just demand your strength, it demanded your memory, your silence, your endurance of cold, hunger, and loss. And still, tomorrow would come, and with it, the next test. Had only just stepped outside. But no footsteps led away from the homes, no tracks through the earth, no signs of flight or fight. It was as if the inhabitants had simply vanished. The centurion gave orders quickly and quietly. Half the men were sent to search the village, while the others formed a perimeter. Gaius entered the nearest hut with another veteran, a Briton called Corvinus, who had once been a charioteer before Rome's conquest broke his world into service. They moved like wolves, measured, precise, suspicious of silence. Inside the house, the walls were painted with red clay symbols, local folk patterns. Gaius ran his hand along the hearthstone, cold, days cold. Dust had not yet claimed the surfaces fully, and the candles had melted down to the wick. He turned to Corvinus, who simply shook his head. Another house was found with a cup of water beside the door. Not spilled, not moved, clear as glass. The well still drew water. Even the grain store had not been raided. Whatever had happened, it had not been panic. It had not been war. You were called into a hut to help search. The air was thick with the scent of sage and old wool. You touched nothing at first, only looked. A small cot lay in the corner, carved with careful hands. A blanket still folded atop it, and beside the bed a pair of sandals, one of them turned sideways as if someone had paused mid-step and never returned. Then you found the statue. It was small, no taller than your forearm, and carved from olive wood. It depicted a woman, veiled and faceless, with hands pressed together. Not Roman, not in any temple you had ever entered, not even among the tolerated gods of the provinces. You showed it to Gaius. He studied it in silence, then nodded once and took it from your hands. "Burn the hut," he said. It was not an order from the centurion. It was not even protocol, but it was done all the same. Soon, other legionaries reported similar findings. Small tokens, effigies, strange carvings tucked into corners behind doors buried in ash, some wrapped in black cloth, others half melted as if burned once before. The centurion stood in the village square, staring at the well. A rope swayed gently in the breeze, a bucket halfway down, dry as dust. He turned to Gaius. Superstition? He asked. Gaius didn't answer immediately. Then he said, perhaps, but something in his voice sounded uncertain. By mid-afternoon, the decision was made. They would remain overnight, posting double watches. The huts were deemed safer than tents. You were assigned a home near the outer edge, along with 3 others, 2 Spaniards and a Gaul, none of them talkative. Inside, the house felt warmer than the open air. There was still wood in the corner and a small hearth. One of the Spaniards lit a modest flame. No one objected. Gaius took a position outside the largest house in the village, the only one with 2 rooms. He would take first watch there. His posture remained relaxed, but his eyes swept the trees constantly. As dusk deepened, the village grew quieter still. Even the birds seemed to avoid the place. The crackling of small fires inside the huts barely broke the hush. And then, as the last sliver of sun dipped behind the hills, the wind began. It was not strong, but it was strange. It came in brief whirls, soft, almost whispering, circling the houses and sending dust down the main path. Some men spoke of it, low and uneasy. One claimed he heard his name in it. Another swore the wind had carried the scent of fresh lilies, though none grew in the region. You tried to sleep, but sleep did not come easily. The straw mattress crackled beneath you. Your body ached, but your thoughts moved too fast. Every creak of wood sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind, a voice. In the middle of the night, one of the Spaniards left the hut to relieve himself. He did not return. At first, the others assumed he'd found another fire to sit by or had been called to stand watch. But an hour passed, then another, and when one of the others went to look, he found no trace, no footprints, no scent, nothing. A quiet panic began to build. You were sent to fetch Gaius. You found him at his post, awake, unmoving, watching the darkness as if it might answer him. When you told him, he said nothing. He simply stood and followed. A search was ordered. Torches were lit, the outer edge of the village combed, but not a single sign was found, not a broken twig, not a shifted stone. Then a torchbearer near the tree line cried out. He had found something. They gathered, Gaius among them, and saw the markings in the earth. Not tracks, not human, just a series of shallow lines like fingers or roots dragged through the dirt in strange looping patterns. They led nowhere, and then stopped. Gaius looked at the centurion, his voice low. We leave at first light. The centurion hesitated. Rome did not retreat lightly, but finally nodded. The watch was doubled again. No one slept easily, and you, lying on your side in the straw, stared at the rafters above, wondering how a village could disappear without sound, without struggle, without blood, and whether perhaps some part of it still remained, hidden, watching, waiting. Before the first pale threads of dawn stretched across the sky, the camp was already in motion. Gaius had not slept. He stood in the center of the deserted village, shield on his back, sword ready, eyes fixed eastward. He had nothing to say. His silence spoke for all of them. The disappearance of the Spaniard remained unexplained. And as the legionaries packed their gear and doused their fires, a heavy stillness gripped the air. Even the usual morning grumbles were gone. It was as if every man feared that noise itself might wake something best left sleeping. The centurion gave no speeches, only a single motion of his hand. The column formed, smaller now, with tighter ranks. You took your place at the rear, eyes darting off into the tree line. They marched without the usual cadence, no songs, no calls, just the steady thump of feet on hardened earth. It was said that the Roman march was as fearsome as battle itself, order made visible. But today, that order felt brittle. They passed the village boundary and entered the thick woods again. The air was damp, as if rain had fallen and vanished in the night. Low mist clung to the undergrowth, curling around ankles and muting footsteps. The path ahead looked unchanged, yet unfamiliar. Gaius walked near the front, flanked by Corvinus and another veteran named Livius, a quiet man with a limp and a scarred cheek that never fully healed. None of them spoke. Their eyes scanned the woods, not for rebels or beasts, but for something else, something none of them could name. 2 hours passed, then 3. The path twisted downward into a narrow gully. On either side, the forest rose steeply, trees leaning inward like listeners. It was there that the second disappearance happened. You saw it yourself. One moment, the Gaul ahead of you was present, his shield tapping lightly against his calf. The next, he was simply gone. No sound, no movement, just absence. The ranks froze. A shout rose. Too loud, too sudden, but Gaius barked a command that snapped every man into stillness. Do not run. Even those who didn't understand Latin felt the urgency in his tone. They retraced the Gauls' steps. Nothing. No sign of struggle. The mist was still untouched, as though it hadn't noticed. Again, strange patterns were found, low in the brush, traced in damp soil. Circular, spiraling. Familiar now in a way that tightened the throat. The centurion ordered a faster pace. Not retreat, never retreat, but withdrawal under discipline. Still the forest deepened. It grew darker, though the sun was surely rising somewhere beyond the clouds. Branches nodded overhead, turning daylight into a sickly green dusk. The column moved in tight, compact ranks. Every sound became a warning, every shadow a suspicion. At midday, they broke into a clearing. The grass was thick and unusually tall, brushing against knees and greaves. In the center stood a stone. It was rough, moss-covered and half-buried, but unmistakably shaped by hands. Not Roman hands. Carvings traced its sides. Not letters. Not art. Symbols, those same looping root-like curves. Fresh. As if someone had passed through that morning. The centurion ordered no pause, but Gaius stepped forward just briefly and placed one hand on the stone. His fingers hovered over the symbols. He muttered a name, just one. You didn't recognize it. Then they moved on. You marched until the forest thinned. The mist faded. The road brightened, but no one spoke of relief. The missing were not forgotten. They hung like iron weights from every man's shoulders. That night they camped not far from the original road, near a shallow stream. No more village ruins, no strange totems, just the open plain and the sound of water. Still watches were doubled. No fire was lit. You lay beneath your cloak, trying to keep warm against the breeze that swept down from the hills. Gaius sat nearby, cleaning his gladius with slow, methodical strokes. He did not sleep, nor did Corvinus, who carved lines into a piece of pine wood, one for each name lost. The centurion met with the tribune under the cover of darkness, voices low, urgent. The order was clear. Return to the main camp by the shortest route, report everything, and leave no man behind. Yet the wind whispered again that night. It was softer than before, less like a breeze, more like breath. And far off in the hills to the north, a light flickered. Not fire, not a star, something in between. Gaius watched it for a long time. Then slowly he placed his sword back into its sheath. You closed your eyes against the chill and dreamt of circles, spirals, stones, and silence. The morning brought a different kind of silence. Not the tense, expectant hush of men holding their breath, but a quiet that felt unnatural. Even the stream that had murmured beside the camp now trickled so softly it barely stirred the grass along its banks. The wind had stilled. The air hung motionless, heavy like wool soaked through. Gaius was already standing when the first stirrings of the camp began. He had not slept. No one truly had. Corvinus sat beside the cold ashes of a fire that had never been lit, his pinewood sliver forgotten in the dirt, his eyes unfocused. The centurion moved among the men, saying nothing, but watching them with a gaze sharpened by years of seeing soldiers fray. And something was fraying now. You rose slowly, the stiffness in your legs matched only by the gnawing in your belly. The rations were opened without ceremony, and every hand moved with the wariness of men who no longer measured time by days or hours, but by absences. Another count was taken. All were present, a fragile kind of relief, brittle and uncertain. They set out again, this time westward, along a path Gaius claimed would intersect the larger military road that led back to the regional fortress. He spoke softly to the centurion, using gestures more than words. He avoided saying anything about the light in the hills. You remembered it, though, that strange flicker, neither torch nor star, pulsing in the northern sky like a distant thought. The path curved along a low ridge. It should have felt open, safer, but the sun did not rise fully that day. A gray sheen settled over everything, diffusing the light into something cold and directionless. The men marched, but none could say for how long. Then the ground changed. First it was the color, less earth, more ash. The soil took on a gray hue, fine and soft, and the grass gave way to patches of brittle white moss. Then came the smell, faint like old smoke soaked into stone. It didn't sting, it lingered. The veterans noticed it first. Gaius slowed his steps. Livius moved his hand to his hilt without command. They crested a low slope and found what should not have been there, a second village. Identical in structure to the first, Same layout, same style of hut, even the same central well. But none of them had maps that showed two such settlements in such close proximity. The land here was too wild, too isolated. Roman planners never permitted redundancy without reason. The centurion ordered a halt. The men remained in formation as scouts approached. But no orders came to enter, because this village, this copy, was not abandoned. It was collapsed. Huts lay in disarray, some flattened as if pressed from above. Others stood, but broken, walls bowing inward, thatch roofs sunken and shredded like paper. No signs of fire, no markings of battle, just ruin. The well had burst at the top, stones scattered water-dried to mud, and then they found the bones. Not many, scattered, shattered, half buried in ash, tucked into corners, some not larger than a child's arm. All bleached, stripped of flesh, no teeth marks, no blade cuts, as if time itself had devoured them. Gaius did not go in. He stood at the edge of the ruins, watching the smoke-gray clouds swirl above. His fingers hovered near the pouch at his belt, the one where he had kept the wooden idol from the first village. You saw him look at it once, then glance away. The centurion gave no order to search. Instead, he called for a detour, west by southwest, through the lowlands, skirting the hills entirely. But as the column began to move, one of the younger soldiers cried out. His foot had sunk through something soft. The ash concealed a hole, narrow, just wide enough for a man to fall. He scrambled back, but not before revealing the edge of a shaft beneath. The centurion came forward, knelt, peered in. A staircase, carved stone, spiraling downward. Gaius approached slowly. He looked into the opening and said one word, "Old." The centurion straightened. He looked down at the staircase, then back at the ruined village. "No one enters," he said. No one argued. The shaft was filled in as best as could be managed. Stones rolled into the opening, ash packed around it. They did not linger. They marched again. This time every step was heavy with memory. That night, the camp was made with full defenses, ditches dug, palisades placed, even watchfires allowed. The centurion permitted it. He did not say why. No one strayed from the perimeter. Even the latrines were dug close. Men moved in pairs. The air remained cold, though no wind stirred. You lay near the outer ditch, under your cloak, eyes fixed on the stars, though few were visible. A gray mist dulled the heavens, and then without sound the light returned. It pulsed once from the hills to the north, distant, dim, then again, and again. Not fire, not torch, something else, and in its rhythm, a pattern. Gaius rose slowly, sword sheathed, helmet in hand. He did not look at you. He only watched the light, as if it were calling, and part of him remembered how to listen. The morning brought a different kind of silence, not the tense, expectant hush of men holding their breath, but a quiet that felt unnatural. Even the stream that had murmured beside the camp now trickled so softly it barely stirred the grass along its banks. The wind had stilled. The air hung motionless, heavy like wool soaked through. Gaius was already standing when the first stirrings of the camp began. He had not slept. No one truly had. Corvinus sat beside the cold ashes of a fire that had never been lit, his pinewood sliver forgotten in the dirt, his eyes unfocused. The centurion moved among the men, saying nothing, but watching them with a gaze sharpened by years of seeing soldiers fray. And something was fraying now. You rose slowly, the stiffness in your legs matched only by the gnawing in your belly. The rations were opened without ceremony, and every hand moved with the wariness of men who no longer measured time by days or hours, but by absences. Another count was taken. All were present. A fragile kind of relief, brittle and uncertain. They set out again, this time westward, along a path Gaius claimed would intersect the larger military road that led back to the regional fortress. He spoke softly to the centurion, using gestures more than words. He avoided saying anything about the light in the hills. You remembered it, though. That strange flicker, neither torch nor star, pulsing in the northern sky like a distant thought. The path curved along a low ridge. It should have felt open, safer. But the sun did not rise fully that day. A gray sheen settled over everything, diffusing the light into something cold and directionless. The men marched, but none could say for how long. Then the ground changed. First it was the color, less earth, more ash. The soil took on a gray hue, fine and soft, and the grass gave way to patches of brittle white moss. Then came the smell, faint like old smoke soaked into stone. It didn't sting, it lingered. The veterans noticed it first. Gaius slowed his steps. Livius moved his hand to his hilt without command. They crested a low slope and found what should not have been there. A second village, identical in structure to the first. Same layout, same style of hut, even the same central well. But none of them had maps that showed two such settlements in such close proximity. The land here was too wild, too isolated. Roman planners never permitted redundancy without reason. The centurion ordered a halt. The men remained in formation as scouts approached, but no orders came to enter, because this village, this copy, was not abandoned. It was collapsed. Huts lay in disarray, some flattened as if pressed from above. Others stood, but broken, walls bowing inward, thatch roofs sunken and shredded like paper. No signs of fire, no markings of battle, just ruin. The well had burst at the top, stones scattered, water dried to mud, and then they found the bones. Not many. Scattered, shattered, half buried in ash, tucked into corners, some not larger than a child's arm, all bleached, stripped of flesh. No teeth marks, no blade cuts, as if time itself had devoured them. Gaius did not go in. He stood at the edge of the ruins, watching the smoke-gray clouds swirl above. His fingers hovered near the pouch at his belt, the one where he had kept the wooden idol from the first village. You saw him look at it once, then glance away. The centurion gave no order to search. Instead, he called for a detour, west by southwest through the lowlands, skirting the hills entirely. But as the column began to move, one of the younger soldiers cried out. His foot had sunk through something soft. The ash concealed a hole, narrow, just wide enough for a man to fall. He scrambled back, but not before revealing the edge of a shaft beneath. The centurion came forward, knelt, peered in. A staircase, carved stone, spiraling downward. Gaius approached slowly. He looked into the opening and said one word, "Old." The centurion straightened. He looked down at the staircase, then back at the ruined village. "No one enters," he said. No one argued. The shaft was filled in as best as could be managed. Stones rolled into the opening, ash packed around it. They did not linger. They marched again. This time, every step was heavy with memory. That night, the camp was made with full defenses. Ditches dug, palisades placed, even watchfires allowed. The centurion permitted it. He did not say why. No one strayed from the perimeter. Even the latrines were dug close. Men moved in pairs. The air remained cold, though no wind stirred. You lay near the outer ditch, under your cloak, eyes fixed on the stars, though few were visible. A gray mist dulled the heavens, and then without sound the light returned. It pulsed once from the hills to the north, distant, dim, then again and again. Not fire, not torch, something else, and in its rhythm a pattern. Gaius rose slowly, sword sheathed, helmet in hand. He did not look at you. He only watched the light, as if it were calling, and part of him remembered how to listen. By the next morning, the pulsing light in the northern hills had faded, but it left behind a strange hush in the air, as though something deep beneath the soil had exhaled and then fallen still. No bird calls rose to greet the dawn. No breeze stirred the grass. Even the insects, ever persistent in the open lands, seemed to have fled. Gaius had not returned to sleep after seeing the light. He stood through the remainder of the night beside the ditch, one hand resting lightly on his gladius, the other on the pommel of his helmet. His silhouette remained motionless even as the horizon slowly brightened. Some said he hadn't moved at all, as though frozen in contemplation or anticipation. The camp rose slowly. No horn sounded, no barked orders. Instead, each man stirred as if waking from a shared dream, the kind that lingers at the edge of the senses and whispers warnings in forgotten languages. The centurion called the column to readiness without delay. He made no mention of the light, nor the second village, nor the shaft. He simply gave the direction, west by southwest, and expected every foot to follow. They moved quickly, not out of fear. Fear had long since settled into a deeper form of knowing. A quiet understanding that something old, older than Rome, older than roads, lay beneath the lands they marched through. And Rome, for all its power, had never quite conquered the soil, only arranged it. By midday, they reached a series of low ridges dotted with stone markers. These were not Roman. They bore no names, just flat, wide slabs set into the earth, marked with lines too worn to decipher. Some were barely knee-high. Others stood like hunched figures, tilted toward one another as though caught mid-conversation. The men avoided them instinctively. Even the mules refused to pass too close, requiring extra coaxing and careful handling. One animal bolted when its hoof struck the base of one of the stones, and its cries echoed far too loudly for comfort. It was calmed only with difficulty. Gaius paused near one marker, crouched beside it. The symbols on its surface had eroded to the faintest impressions, circular again, spirals etched shallow into the stone. He ran a thumb along the groove. "The same hand," he said quietly. No one asked whose. Corvinus stood a few paces away, arms crossed, face grim. He carried a bundle wrapped in cloth, one of the strange figures found in the second village. He would not put it down, though no one had asked why he kept it. The centurion gave the order to continue. By late afternoon, they reached the banks of a shallow river, its waters pale and fast-flowing over smooth stone. The map Gaius carried confirmed it, the northern branch of the Salva, a known route. The road to the fortress was no more than a day's march away. A relief, thin but real, passed through the column. They crossed the river carefully, constructing a narrow footbridge from fallen logs and rope. The process took time. Every hand was needed. You held the line steady as Gaius and two others guided the first mule across. The water bit cold against your feet, but it was real, grounded, unchanging. Across the bank, the trees grew less dense, the land opening to wide grass fields. It felt better, easier to breathe. The sky seemed higher, the clouds less oppressive. That evening, the camp was set beside the riverbank. Fires were allowed again, though kept low. Rations were shared more freely. The centurion even permitted quiet conversation around the flames. And still, Gaius said little. He sat apart, sharpening his blade as if the act itself were an incantation. Corvinus watched the stars, his wrapped bundle beside him like a sleeping child. Livius drank water from a curved wooden ladle and did not speak at all. You sat close to the others, listening to their quiet mutterings. Some talked of the fortress baths, others of their families. One soldier mentioned the games scheduled for the next month, a chance perhaps to wager a few coins or catch a glimpse of the circus beasts. For a moment there was the sound of laughter, thin, cautious, but real. And then it stopped. A sound, soft and deliberate, came from the far edge of camp. It was not the wind, it was footsteps. Slow, dragging, as if the ground resisted them. Every man froze. Gaius stood before the sound ended. From the shadows beyond the camp ditch, a shape emerged. It was the Spaniard, the one who had disappeared days before. He stepped into the firelight slowly, eyes unfocused, hands empty, mouth slack. His armor was gone, his tunic was torn. Dirt caked his arms, and something dark was smeared across his cheek. No one moved, no one spoke. He looked at no one directly, but walked in a slow, winding path toward the center of the camp. Not stumbling, not lost, but as though following something none of them could see. Then he stopped. He raised his eyes, and for the first time, you saw them. They were pale, not white, not blind, just emptied, like the light behind them had been pulled out thread by thread. Gaius approached, slowly, gladius in hand, but lowered. The Spaniard blinked once and spoke. His voice was dry and distant, like wind scraping across old stones. "Don't follow," he said. Then he collapsed. No breath, no heartbeat, only silence. Gaius knelt beside the body but did not touch it. He looked toward the hills, toward the place the light had come from, and said nothing at all. The body was not buried. At Gaius's insistence, and with the centurion's silent assent, the Spaniard's remains were wrapped in a woolen cloak and placed atop a slab of stone near the river's bend. No rites were said, no coins for the ferryman. Only a simple marker was placed beside him, a pile of 3 stones, each flat and dark, arranged in a triangle. An old sign, not Roman. No one spoke of it. The rest of the night passed in uneasy quiet. Fires were left to burn lower than usual. The usual chatter and murmured prayers before sleep had vanished. You lay wrapped tightly in your cloak, eyes fixed on the pale embers, half expecting them to blink back at you. Come morning, the mood in the camp had changed again. The firelight had revealed something during the night. Small things, easy to miss if you didn't know to look. Circular indentations around the perimeter. Soil that had been freshly disturbed. Not footprints, not quite, but something had passed close. The centurion ordered an immediate march. No one questioned him. The final stretch to the fortress should have taken a full day, but they moved faster. The weariness in their limbs was not enough to slow the pace. The fear beneath it drove them forward like a second heart. You felt it too, that tingling at the base of the spine, that old animal instinct that hadn't dulled despite the discipline of Legion life. By midday, the outer posts of the Roman road came into view. Sturdy markers, carved stone bearing the imperial crest. One bore the names of 2 governors long dead. Another marked the miles to the fortress, 5 remaining. The veterans let out soft, cautious breaths, and then Corvinus stopped walking. It was so sudden, it took a moment for the line behind him to halt. He stood at the side of the road, eyes fixed on something in the grass. At his feet was another pile of stones, 3, flat, dark, arranged in a triangle, exactly like the one left by the river. Livius was the first to speak. His voice cracked as he said, "It followed." No one replied. Gaius stepped forward and without a word scattered the stones with his boot, not roughly, not with fury, but slowly, as if dismantling a trap. Corvinus stared at him, then at the empty ground, and walked on. The road stretched on, the trees thinning with every mile. The sky opened wider. The scent of hearth smoke began to reach their noses, thin tendrils of civilization. Walls, soldiers, hot food. The fortress was close. When the outer gates appeared over the rise, some of the men let out sounds that bordered on laughter. Others cried quietly. They didn't hide it. The gate guards looked down in confusion as the column approached, less by their early return than by the state of them. Men thinned by fear, boots worn too smooth, eyes that had seen something beyond the field. The gates opened without delay. Inside, life resumed its familiar rhythm. The sound of hammers striking iron, of orders barked in proper cadence, of soldiers moving in formation. You had expected comfort to return with the fortress walls. It didn't. Gaius spoke little upon arrival. He reported to the tribune personally, his words clipped and spare. He handed over the satchel that had once held the carved idol, now filled only with ash and earth. He did not wait for questions. Corvinus asked to be transferred the next day. Livius did not appear at morning drills, and the centurion, once firm, once sharp as the vine stick at his belt, walked with a slight hunch now, as though the air had grown heavier since returning. You were assigned barrack space with other new recruits. They asked you what happened. You didn't speak. That night, as you tried to sleep on a clean cot beneath a tiled roof, the warmth of security all around you, you found your thoughts drifting back to the hills, to the village that should not have been, to the man who returned without eyes, to the shapes traced in dust, and to the pulsing light that even now you half suspected you might see again if you looked toward the northern window. And outside, somewhere beyond the walls, the wind shifted, and the stones waited. The fortress resumed its rhythm. Orders were posted at dawn. Bread was handed out in stiff rounds, the kind that required strong teeth and stronger patience. Horses were groomed in the lower stables. Blacksmiths resumed their hammering. Reports were scribed in triplicate, sealed, and dispatched by mounted courier along the stone-cut roads. From the outside, it looked as though nothing had changed. But within the barracks, something had. The returning detachment, yours, was treated with a curious mix of distance and scrutiny. The other legionaries, those who had stayed behind, did not ask many questions. They spoke in short tones, handed supplies without eye contact, and made room at benches without invitation. Whatever had happened beyond the tree line had already begun to carry a shape, passed not through official reports, but through the movement of men and their silences. You spent your first night beneath the fortress roof with a strange sense of unease. Not fear, not exactly, but displacement, as though your body had returned to safety, yet something deeper had not followed. Gaius did not eat in the mess hall. He was seen only once the next day, sharpening his blade near the southern wall, away from the clamor of drills. A young officer approached him with a scroll in hand, requesting clarification on his account of the march. Gaius did not respond. After a moment, the officer left without pressing further. Later that evening, you found yourself standing in the archive room, a low-ceilinged chamber kept cool by thick stone walls and lined with clay tablets and waxed codices. The senior scribe, a balding man with yellowed eyes, watched you curiously as you searched the racks. You didn't quite know what you were looking for. Something about old settlements, patterns of migration, records of disappearances. You found nothing. Nothing official, at least. But as you turned to leave, the scribe cleared his throat. "There is one," he said. You paused. "One file," he continued. "Not a formal entry, not by Roman hands." He stepped aside and retrieved a narrow wooden box from the bottom of a cabinet behind his desk. From within, he pulled a bundle of vellum sheets bound in faded red cord. No seals, no wax. The top sheet bore a single word, obscura. It was not Latin, not Greek, not even the wild languages of the northern tribes. You had never seen it before. Inside were sketches, not drawings of men or battlefields, but symbols, spirals, knots, stones arranged in threes. Beneath them, short notes in faded ink, found again in the hills east of Vallis. Always the triangle, always silence. Another page read, "Those who see the light often wake different, eyes pale, voice hollow." You asked who had written it. The scribe shook his head. "No name. The bundle came before I did, passed from scribe to scribe. No one dares to burn it." You took nothing from the room. But that night, sleep did not come easily. In the darkness of your cot, you turned toward the wall and found yourself listening again for sounds that did not belong. Whispers, footsteps, the soft scrape of stones across one another. And in the courtyard outside, Gaius stood motionless again, watching the northern sky. On the second day, the fortress commander sent for him. The centurion delivered the summons, his expression unreadable. Gaius followed without a word. He returned only once, briefly, to gather his effects. You asked him if he was being reassigned. "No," he said. "I asked." "Where?" you asked. He looked out toward the hills, to the edge. You understood. By the third night, he was gone. No ceremony, no farewell, just absence again. In the mess hall, Corvinus sat at the edge of a table, still clutching the wrapped figure he had carried from the ruined village. He had not unwrapped it since returning. His food remained untouched. One of the other soldiers finally spoke. "You should burn it." Corvinus didn't respond. He looked down at the bundle, then finally said, "It's not mine." On the fourth night, it rained. Hard, steady rain that struck the tiles with rhythmic force. It drowned out footsteps. It masked distant sounds. And as you lay in your cot, staring at the beams overhead, a thought returned to you, one that had grown louder with each passing day. The light had not followed you, not because it couldn't, but because it didn't need to. It was waiting. And you, despite the walls, the uniforms, the discipline, and the drills, were not far from it at all. You closed your eyes, and for the first time in days, you dreamed, not of home, but of spirals drawn in ash. The rain fell for 2 days without pause. It soaked the parade grounds, turned the training pits into slick fields of mud, and left the stone corridors echoing with the ceaseless patter of water against tile and stone. The fortress became a place of shadows and murmurs, its usual precision dulled under gray skies and the weight of something unspoken. You carried out your duties as instructed, drills in the morning, inspections in the afternoon, but everything felt distant, like reenacting the habits of another life. You no longer walked with the same rhythm. Your hand drifted often to the hilt of your blade, even when there was no reason. You listened for the sound of horns, but none came. Corvinus was not seen the following morning. His cot was empty, the bundle gone. The legionary said nothing, but the silence around his absence was louder than any rumor. By the 5th day, the rain ceased, the air cleared, but the earth remained sodden. Mist clung low over the fortress in the mornings, curling between the walls and the watchtowers, softening the outlines of everything familiar. That morning, you were summoned by name. A runner from the command post delivered the message with a firm voice, but averted eyes. You were to report to the central chamber, where the fortress commander rarely called for common soldiers, especially not ones without rank. Inside, the air was colder than expected. The room bore no decoration beyond the carved imperial standards on either side of the stone seat. Behind the commander stood 2 tribunes and a scribe. You were not questioned about tactics or terrain. Instead, the commander asked, "Did you see the light?" You hesitated. He repeated the question. This time you nodded. He leaned back in his chair. His hands were clasped, fingers steepled. The tribunes remained silent. The scribe wrote nothing. The commander said, "It has happened before, not often, but enough." Then, after a pause, "Most men forget, some do not." You said nothing. He reached into a drawer beneath the table and retrieved a small bundle, wrapped in cloth the color of smoke. He placed it on the table, unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a carved stone, triangular, dark, with the now familiar spirals etched into each face. It was found in the armory, he said. No one saw who placed it there. He studied you. Do you recognize it? You didn't answer, not with words. Instead, your eyes moved toward the spiral, and for a moment, just a moment, it seemed to pulse like breath beneath stone. The commander nodded once, then rewrapped the object. You're being transferred, he said. Tomorrow morning, South Post, you'll serve under Tribune Herennius. The South Post was far from the hills. You were being sent away, not as punishment, not as reward, but as removal. You were dismissed without ceremony. Back in the barracks, if the other soldiers had already heard, news traveled faster than crows. Some offered nods, others avoided your gaze. One younger recruit, the kind who still cleaned his boots twice a day, asked quietly if it was true that something had followed you. You didn't respond. Instead, you packed your kit with slow hands, each item placed carefully, as though the weight of your life could be folded into a satchel and made bearable. That night, sleep came early, heavy, unnatural, and with it a dream. You stood once more in the village, not the one with walls and huts, but the one that existed somewhere beneath memory, the one built from circles and stone. The sky above was not sky, but ash. The wind did not blow, yet the trees moved. Ahead of you stood Gaius. He was older, his armor worn differently, but his eyes, those had not changed. He lifted a hand and pointed, not toward the horizon, but downward. Beneath your feet, the soil began to part. Spirals opened like petals. Darkness breathed below. And from the depths, a voice, not spoken but known, said a single word, return. You woke at dawn, breath still caught in your throat. The sky outside the barracks was pale and cloudless. Your orders waited by the door. The path south would take 5 days. You would leave by the main gate before midday. But even as you stepped into the road, pack at your side, boots clean, eyes sharp, you knew one truth that would never leave you. The spiral was not behind you. It had never been behind you. It had only ever been within. The road south was straight and clean, cut by Roman engineers with mathematical precision. It followed the lay of the land where it could, bent where it must, and rose over low hills with such gentle grade that even the mules barely noticed. Markers stood at regular intervals, carved stone bearing the familiar names of emperors and governors long past, their inscriptions weathered but legible. Your journey began with little ceremony. The fortress gates closed behind you before midday, and the sound of them, wood and iron grinding into place, lingered in your ears longer than it should have. The sun hung high, the sky pale and nearly cloudless. Dust clung to your sandals, and the steady rhythm of your steps became your only companion. You were not alone on the road. 2 other legionaries had been assigned the same post, both veterans of other campaigns. One, Marcus Silanus, was lean and sharp-eyed, his face drawn tight by long years on the Germanic frontier. The other, alias Vorenus, carried the wide shoulders and quiet demeanor of a man who had seen more battles than he remembered. Neither asked about the northern hills. They had their own stories, no doubt, but they knew when not to tell them. The first night was spent beneath a grove of olive trees. You set camp by a narrow stream, ate in silence, and shared a fire that gave more comfort than heat. The stars above felt distant. You looked for patterns, for the ones you had once known as a boy, the hunter, the ship, the twins. But none of them held their shape anymore. You dreamed of stones again, not spirals this time. Circles within circles, each one deeper, sinking into the earth like rings in water. The second day passed in more silence. Villages appeared now and then, true villages, with people and animals, with carts and children playing near fountains. You passed them without incident. At one, you filled your water skin and received a nod from a gray-haired woman who eyed your armor but said nothing. Marcus bought a handful of dates from a vendor and chewed them slowly, one by one. Vorenus left a coin at a shrine, though he didn't name the god. That night, as the fire cracked and your companions drifted into sleep, you remained awake and heard the sound again. At first it was the wind, soft, stirring the olive leaves. But then came something beneath it, just low enough to question. Not a voice, not music, a rhythm, like a pulse. You sat upright, listening. It stopped. The fire hissed in the silence, its last ember folding into ash. You did not sleep again. The third day brought the sea. You smelled it before you saw it, a briny, honest smell that reminded you of ports, of trade, of salt caked into wood and bronze. The road curved westward briefly, revealing a wide view of the coast. Gulls wheeled overhead. The sound of their cries was jarring, almost foreign. The south post waited inland, near a low range of hills that rolled like the backs of sleeping beasts. You arrived at dusk. It was smaller than the main fortress, just a square compound of stone and timber, surrounded by a dry moat and palisade. The gates were open, the guards relaxed. You gave your name, showed your orders, and were waved through. The commander at the south post was a short, broad man named Septimus Herennius. He welcomed you with the disinterest of someone who had spent too long at the edge of maps. He did not ask questions. He assigned you a bunk and pointed you toward the well. Your companions were sent to opposite ends of the compound. That evening, you sat by the interior fire pit, sipping watered wine and watching the flames. A few other soldiers were there. Quiet, tired men, their armor clean but worn. One of them sharpened an axe slowly, the rhythm of it oddly calming. Across from you sat a man with pale eyes. Not blind, not dull, just pale. He watched you for a long time before speaking. "You came from the north," he said. You didn't answer. He leaned forward slightly. "I've seen the light too," he whispered, and then he smiled, slowly, sorrowfully. "It's here too, just quieter." You looked away, but something in his words stayed with you. That night the barracks were quiet. The wood creaked gently with the wind. Outside, an owl called once and fell silent. You lay on your cot, listening to the rhythm of your breath, and then you heard it again, that low, steady pulse. Not of blood, not of drums, but of earth, breathing, waiting, remembering. The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm. The southern post was quiet, methodical, almost forgettable. It existed more as a boundary marker than a strategic point, an outpost designed to remind passing merchants, wandering shepherds, and curious travelers that this land belonged to Rome. There were no threats here, no rebel whispers, no signs of barbarian scouts, only hills, dust, and long stretches of road. You were assigned to perimeter patrols. Every morning, just after dawn, you and 3 others walked the outer boundary in pairs, sometimes to the east along the dry riverbed, sometimes to the west beneath the white cliffs that overlooked the sea. The air was dry, the sky often clear, and for a time you began to believe that whatever had touched the northern hills had not followed you. But it had. Not in the form of lights or voices or sudden disappearances. Not yet. It began with the dreams. They were subtle at first, half-formed images, easily forgotten. But as the nights passed, they grew clearer, more specific. You saw the same village again and again, always in ash. The hut stood upright, but empty. The central well bubbled not with water, but with black dust. And in each dream, you were walking in circles, unable to stop, your feet tracing the same path again and again. In one dream, Gaius stood at the edge of the well. He didn't speak. He only held out his hand. When you tried to take it, he stepped back into the darkness and was gone. You stopped mentioning your dreams. The pale-eyed man at the post, his name was Lucullus, watched you often, though he said little more. He spent most of his time near the southern watchtower, staring out at the hills beyond the road. Sometimes you found him with small stones in his hands, arranging them into shapes before scattering them again. You recognized the shapes. One night, just before curfew, you passed him as he knelt by the outer wall. His hands moved with slow precision, placing 3 flat stones into a triangle. You stopped. He looked up at you, his expression tired, almost apologetic. "It's not a warning," he said. "It's a key." You didn't ask to what. The next day, the wind changed. It came from the east now, dry and sharp, carrying dust from beyond the hills. It stung the eyes and rattled the wooden shutters. Birds flew lower. The guards complained of headaches. One man collapsed during drill, claiming he heard whispers in the gusts. The medicus found nothing wrong. You knew better. That night, you walked to the edge of the post under the pretense of latrine duty. You climbed the southern watchtower and stood alone beneath the stars, the wind tugging at your cloak. And far to the east, where the hills bled into the dark, you saw the light. Faint, pulsing, slow, not fire, not man-made, but familiar. It didn't frighten you, not anymore. Instead, it stirred something in you, a memory that wasn't yours, a path that had already been walked. When you descended the tower, Lucullus was waiting. He didn't ask what you saw. He only said, When the stone opens, don't look down. You return to your cot, heart beating steady but heavy. In the stillness of the barracks, a new thought took hold. What if Gaius hadn't vanished into the dark? What if he had stepped through something? Not into death, but into something older. And what if it had recognized him? You didn't sleep. You only listened, to the wind, to the creaking beams, to the long breath of something beneath the earth, remembering the shapes of your footsteps. The next morning broke without color. A pale veil of mist clung to the landscape, swallowing the road and softening the edges of the hills until they looked like the outlines of old sleeping gods. Even the sun, when it rose, gave no warmth, only a dim light like the inside of a shuttered lantern. Your orders came just after first meal. Patrol of the Eastern Ridge. You and Lucullus were assigned together. No one seemed surprised. The others avoided your gaze as you read the orders. No one offered the usual nods or shoulder taps. In their silence was the same quiet understanding you had seen before, at the fortress, among the men who had returned from the north. They knew something was shifting. They didn't want to know more. You left the post before midday. The road to the Eastern Ridge wasn't a true path, more a line worn by shepherds in patrol boots, cutting through low brush and patches of wild lavender. The breeze came in sharp gusts, smelling of chalk and something harder to name. Metallic. Old. Lucullus walked ahead at a steady pace, saying nothing. His movements were practiced, careful. He did not speak until the outpost was no longer in sight. "There's a stone up here," he said. "Not on any map." You didn't ask how he knew. The climb was not difficult. The ridge rose in a long curve, dotted with boulders and scattered with low shrubs that bent toward the wind. As you ascended, the world below became quiet, muffled beneath the mist. The road vanished behind you. The outpost disappeared entirely. And then, near the crest, you saw it. The stone. It stood alone, half buried in the earth, leaning slightly as though caught mid-breath. Dark gray, rough-hewn, twice the height of a man. Symbols curled across its surface, spirals, lines, and grooves that seemed too deep for natural erosion. You approached slowly. There were no sounds, not even the wind. The air was thick, expectant. Lucullus stood beside the stone and placed one hand flat against its face. "It breathes," he said, and you believed him. He motioned to the ground. There, barely visible beneath the dust and dry grass, was a ring of stones, small, round, and arranged in a perfect circle, 12 in total. Lucullus stepped into the circle. You hesitated. "Do you know what this is?" you asked. He nodded. "A memory." You said nothing. Your fingers curled tighter around the grip of your gladius. Lucullus knelt. He placed his hands on two of the stones, closed his eyes, and whispered something in a language you had never heard. Not Latin, not Greek, not Gaulish. It was older. The stone responded, not with movement, but with sound, low, resonant, a vibration felt in the chest, not the ears. And then from beneath your feet, a breath, soft, deep, like the opening of a great lung buried in the earth. Lucullus opened his eyes. "It remembers you," he said, and then the ground shifted. Not a quake, not a tremble, just a change, as though the world had blinked. The ridge vanished. The sky above became streaked with a deep ash-colored haze. The landscape around you twisted, no longer dry scrub and familiar hills, but a dark rolling plain covered in black grass and low shifting mists. The stone was still there, but it stood taller now, straighter, whole. Lucullus was gone. You stood alone in the circle, and in the distance far across the plain lights began to appear. Not flames, not stars, but shapes, moving, drawing near. You stepped backward, 1 foot outside the circle. The moment your heel crossed the line, the world shifted again. You were on the ridge. The sky was pale. The outpost was visible below. The stone behind you was crumbled now, broken down the middle like a tree split by lightning. Lucullus sat beside it, breathing hard, face pale. You reached for him, but he waved you off. "I told you," he said, voice shaking. "It's quieter here." He did not rise. You helped him back to the outpost. Neither of you spoke again that day. That night you found a triangle of stones beneath your cot, arranged with care, waiting. You did not sleep that night. The stones beneath your cot, flat, smooth, dark, remained where they were, untouched, as though to disturb them would be to awaken something slumbering in the very boards beneath your feet. You stared at them until the oil lamp burned low, until the shadows shifted and lengthened, until your eyes ached and your limbs trembled with stillness. At some point, just before dawn, you gathered the stones in a cloth and walked outside. The southern sky was beginning to pale. A gentle mist curled along the inner walls of the outpost. The others slept. No footsteps echoed in the yard. No sentry stood watch at the tower. Everything was silent. You climbed the watchtower again. There in the faint light, you unwrapped the stones and laid them gently on the wooden floor. But this time, you changed the pattern. Not a triangle, a line. East to west. You waited. The light grew stronger. The mist receded. But nothing happened. And yet, something had shifted. You felt it in your chest. Not a pressure, but a soft resonance, like a chime deep within your ribs. Faint, familiar, as though something had noticed. Later that morning, you went to check on Lucullus. He had not reported for roll call. His bunk was untouched and his gear still lay arranged with strange precision. No one had seen him since the previous evening. You knew better than to search the ridge. Instead, you found his journal, hidden beneath a loose board in the corner of his bed. It was small, bound in leather so worn the color had faded to gray. Inside, the pages were filled not with records of military duty, but drawings, hundreds of them, some sketched with fine charcoal, others with trembling ink lines. They showed the stone on the ridge. They showed the spirals, the circles, the triangle. And they showed something else. Figures, tall, thin, without face or form. Not demons, not men, just outlines. Always distant, always standing in fields of ash or black grass. Never moving, never closer, but always watching. In the final pages, his script grew harder to read, less legible. The writing bent, curled into itself like the spirals on the stones. One phrase appeared again and again. The door remembers. You closed the book and set it in your satchel. No report was filed for Lucullus. The commander at the outpost said little. He merely marked the absence, then reassigned his duties to another. The silence that followed was not of grief. It was of understanding. Men at the edge of empire learned quickly not to question the shape of disappearances. Over the following days, the wind changed again. It now came from the west, carrying with it a scent like wet stone and something deeper, something old. The animals in the nearby pastures grew uneasy. The shepherds complained of missing lambs. One reported seeing strange patterns in the dirt, spirals etched in the mud, though no hand could have drawn them. The commander sent no patrols. He issued no explanations. He only added a second watch to the northern wall. One evening, a courier arrived from the main fortress with new orders, transfers, resupply notices, disciplinary scrolls sealed with wax. Among them, a single sealed message addressed to you. It bore no insignia, no name. Inside was a small scrap of parchment, aged and stiff. On it, in a hand you recognized but could not name, was written, "Not the stone. What sleeps beneath it?" You folded it carefully, placed it beside Lucullus's journal, and began to watch the ground more closely. You no longer walked straight lines during patrol. You began to listen, not for voices, not for footsteps, but for the breathing. The low, steady inhale and exhale of the land itself. It was not constant, but it returned at intervals, like the slow turning of a tide beneath your feet. And each time it came, you remembered something from the dream. The circles weren't meant to trap you. They were meant to prepare you, to guide your steps. And the closer you followed them, the more the earth began to speak. Not in words, but in memory. The days began to drift. Not pass, not end, just drift, one into another, as though time itself had grown weary of order. The southern post functioned still, with its drills and dispatches, with its rationed bread and sharpened spears, but beneath the discipline was a quiet unraveling. Men began to forget what day it was. Patrols were repeated without change. Reports were filed for incidents that never happened. One soldier claimed he'd seen the same dream 3 nights in a row, though he couldn't remember the details. Another, a seasoned archer, walked out in the fields and stood motionless for hours, staring at the horizon, his bow forgotten in the grass. You wrote nothing in your own reports. Instead, you read. Lucullus's journal became a companion, its pages worn softer with each turn. You learned to read its symbols more than its words. The spirals were no longer decoration. They were paths. Some coiled inward, others outward. And some folded back on themselves, as if they could not decide what direction they were meant to follow. One night, you drew one in the dirt outside your quarters. 3 loops, a break, then a longer arc toward the west. It was a shape you had seen in the journal, marked with the word bomb. a path. When you rose the next morning, the spiral was gone. Not scattered, not washed away. Gone, as though the earth had swallowed it. That same day, the commander summoned you without warning. You found him in his quarters, standing by the window that overlooked the hills. His face was pale, drawn. A parchment lay open on the table beside him, written in hurried Latin, signed with a seal you didn't recognize. He didn't ask you to sit. You were with Gaius, he said. You nodded. You walked north. You saw the second village. You nodded again. He turned from the window, eyes searching yours. Has it followed you? You didn't answer. You didn't need to. His hands tightened on the edge of the table. There's a place, he said quietly, a few miles east of here. Not on maps, not near any patrol lines. He unrolled another scroll, a crude sketch, more a suggestion than a drawing. Hills, a stream, a single mark at the edge of the page, a circle, shaded dark. It's called the Hollow. You looked up. He continued. A trader passed by last week, said the ground there breathes, said animals won't cross it. The locals, they bury nothing nearby. He paused, then added, Lucullus went there once. Before he stopped speaking, he handed you the map. No order, no command, only silence. You left that night alone. The path to the hollow was not difficult. It wound eastward, past a series of crumbled terraces and abandoned animal pens, past stone ruins so old even the local farmers no longer remembered what they once were. The hills opened slowly, like ribs parting, until you stood in a wide depression in the land. Shallow, quiet, rimmed by tall grass that swayed without wind. No birds sang, no insects stirred. You stepped forward and felt it. A vibration, low, rhythmic, not from the air, from below. You knelt and placed your palm to the earth. It was warm, not sun warm, not stone warm, warm like breath. The ground pulsed once, then again. You looked around, no sign of disturbance, no marks, no stone. But in the middle of the hollow, the grass bent in a slow spiral drawn by something unseen. You walked it, one step, then another, around, inward. The rhythm beneath your feet changed, faster, then slower, then still. When you reached the center, you knelt again and dug, only with your hands. The soil came away easily, too easily, as if it wanted to be moved. You dug until your fingers touched stone, smooth, curved, familiar, the top of a circle, a ring perhaps, or a seal. You brushed away more dirt. The spirals were carved deep. The stone was darker than the soil around it. It smelled faintly of salt and something older, wood long buried, or bones forgotten by time. You touched the center, and it moved, not opened, not shifted, but moved, as though something beneath had stirred in recognition. You pulled your hand away and stood quickly, but nothing followed. The hollow remained silent, the grass swayed, and the stone waited. You left without speaking, without looking back. But that night, when you returned to your quarters, the stones had returned beneath your cot, a triangle again, and at its center a single spiral traced in ash. That night, you did not lie down. You sat on the edge of your cot, boots still laced, cloak still fastened, and watched the faint line of moonlight crawl across the floor. The triangle of stones remained exactly where they had been found, untouched, their black surfaces glinting dully in the low light. The spiral at their center, drawn in ash so fine it seemed like smoke held still, did not shift or fade. It simply remained. There was no question now, it was calling. Not with words, not even with images, but with memory, with rhythm, with repetition. At first light before roll call, you returned to the hollow. No orders, no witness. The path was already familiar. The fields remained empty, silent as stone. The air was still. The spiral in the grass had widened since your last visit, its arcs more distinct, more deliberate, as though the land itself had begun to recall the shape. You entered without hesitation. This time, when you reached the center, the soil was loose before your fingers even touched it. You uncovered the stone in seconds, and it was no longer just a circle. A thin crack had formed along the edge, narrow but deep. Not natural, not erosion. A line that curved like a mouth readying to speak. You placed your hand on it again. This time, there was no resistance. The stone moved downward, as though pulled by something far below. You did not see it fall. You only felt the absence. One moment solid, the next, nothing. And in its place, a hole. Dark, narrow, rimmed with damp stone, carved in spiral grooves. A shaft. Stairs led down, rough but even, cut at an angle so precise it could not be guessed. Not hastily made, not new. The stone was old, older than any Roman quarry, smoother than it should be. You paused at the threshold. A breeze drifted up from the hollow, cool and dry, bearing the scent of something untouched by sky or sun. Not rot, not decay. Memory. You descended. The spiral staircase turned counterclockwise, narrowing with each coil. There were no torches, but faint light shimmered along the walls, soft green like moss in deep caves. It did not flicker. It did not cast shadows. It simply was. You lost count of the steps. They carried you down like thought, without effort, without pain. At the bottom, the passage widened. A chamber opened before you, round, domed, the ceiling lost in shadow. The walls bore no writing, but were covered in carvings, spirals, interlocking rings, triangular forms overlapping in patterns that seemed to shift when viewed too long. In the center of the chamber stood a pillar, smooth, narrow, as tall as a man. Upon it, a basin, shallow, filled with still water that did not reflect. You stepped forward. As you approached, the carvings around the room seemed to shift again, curling inward, drawing your eye to the pillar. A low sound began to rise, no louder than breath. A hum, familiar, the rhythm of something ancient. The basin stirred. You looked into it and saw the village, not as it had been found, but as it once was, alive, bright, children running between homes, smoke rising from warm hearts, figures moving, smiling, speaking in languages forgotten by empire. Then the sky changed. A light descended, not fire, not wrath, something else. The figures did not scream, they did not flee. They knelt as though welcoming what came. And then, silence. The basin grew still. The hum ceased. You stepped back, breath shallow, heart steady. The chamber did not tremble. It waited. At the edge of the wall, another passage opened, one you hadn't seen before. It led deeper. You turned to leave. Not out of fear, but preparation. The way was marked. You would return, not alone, not as soldier, as witness. And above in the hills, the grass bent again in slow spirals. The air felt different when you emerged from the hollow. Lighter, yet charged. As though the ground had exhaled and the sky had inhaled in response. The sunlight above was unchanged, muted and pale, filtered through a thin veil of clouds. But the way it touched the landscape felt newly deliberate, casting shadows that lingered too long and light that never quite reached the earth. You didn't look back at the entrance. You knew now it would not appear to another unless it chose to. You returned to the outpost by late afternoon. The gates opened without hesitation, the sentries barely glancing at you. You passed through the yard, into the barracks, through the narrow corridors, and back to your cot. The triangle was gone. In its place lay Lucullus's journal, open, turned to the last page. The words had changed. You had read them all, memorized them. But this page was new. The writing was not his hand. It was yours. Not ink, not charcoal. Something deeper, pressed into the page like it had always been there, waiting for you to arrive. The spiral remembers the shape of its end. You closed the journal and placed it beneath your tunic. That night, the commander summoned you again. His face was drawn tighter than before. The lines near his mouth had deepened, and his voice came slower, as though the very air fought him. Something is waking, he said. The men feel it, even those who do not speak of it. You waited. He did not ask what you had found. He only said, there is another mark. He unrolled a scrap of vellum, rough, creased, scorched at the edges. On it, a single drawing, a symbol half spiral, half eye, carved into the side of the well in a nearby village 2 days to the south. They say the water turned bitter, he said. They found birds dead around it, no tracks, no storm. You knew then where it was leading you, not away from the hollow, deeper into its echo. You left before dawn, again without escort. The road south led through olive groves and dry pastures, then into low, shaded valleys. The village appeared near midday, small, 36 homes, most shuttered. A boy watched you from beneath a fig tree and said nothing. The old men sitting near the square looked away when you passed. The well stood in the center. You approached slowly. It was old, older than the village, older perhaps than the stone around it. The rope and pulley had rotted long ago, replaced by a simple pail on a frayed length of twine. And on the stone lip, the mark, half spiral, half eye, the same as the basin chamber. The water inside was black, still. You dropped a stone in, no sound, no ripple. The depth below did not accept the stone. It disappeared. A woman stepped from one of the homes, her face weathered by time and worry. She went down to fetch water, she said. 2 days ago, my daughter never came back up. You turned slowly. Did she fall? The woman shook her head. She sang, she whispered. We heard her singing as she descended. You looked into the well again, and beneath the reflection of the pale sky, you saw the faintest curl of a spiral, not etched, moving, alive. You left that evening, the sun low behind your back, the journal pressed against your ribs. You did not speak. You did not sleep. You only walked, and somewhere behind you, in the still air of the well, the singing continued, soft, steady, and not quite human. You returned to the outpost under cover of night, boots dusted with pale soil, the sky above heavy with a low-hanging moon that seemed less a source of light and more an observer. No horns called your arrival. No sentry challenged your steps. The gate creaked open as though it had expected you. Inside, all was still. Even the torchlight seemed muted, flickering against stone walls that now bore a fine gray film, like a coat of breath dried into powder. You walked without sound to the barracks, to your cot, to your place in the long hall, but you did not lie down. The journal pulsed with presence beneath your cloak, not warm, not cold, just known. You sat at the edge of your cot and opened it. The page had turned again. There was no new writing, only a mark, faint as if drawn with a fingertip pressed in water. A spiral, broken at the outer edge, its final curve trailing off into a sharp downward stroke, a direction, a descent. The hollow had been the first breath, the well, the first word. What came next was memory itself, laid not in ink but in stone. At dawn, the commander met you in the yard. He said nothing of your absence, only handed you a scroll and nodded once slowly. I'm sending you north, he said, past the forest line. There's a place where the earth sinks. No name, no watch. You opened the scroll. No map, no orders, just coordinates. He met your eyes. Don't come back, he said. You left with a single pack, your cloak, the journal, and your sword. No others followed. The road north was harder now, as though the land itself grew uncertain the further you walked. Paths once familiar twisted oddly, distances stretched. You passed landmarks you did not recognize, shrines long crumbled, trees grown at unnatural angles, their branches like fingers bent in warning. On the third day, the forest opened. Beyond it, the hills fell away into a shallow basin, not like the hollow, but deeper, more ancient, shaped like the palm of a hand left pressed into the earth. You descended without hesitation, feeling the air grow cooler, then heavier, as though each step peeled you further from the world above. In the center stood a stone door, twice the height of a man, black as volcanic glass and perfectly smooth save for a single line of carving spiraling out from its center like veins of silver etched in coal. No hinges, no seams, no locks. The earth around it was silent. You approached slowly, feeling the rhythm return, that low, steady thrum in your bones, the pulse that matched your steps and breath and thoughts all at once. The spiral on the door shimmered faintly as you drew near. You touched it. It was neither warm nor cold, neither rough nor smooth. It felt like memory, something you had not known you carried until it stirred. The carvings responded. They did not glow, they shifted. The spiral rearranged itself before your eyes, the outer loops folding inward, the silver lines curling into a new shape, not a spiral, but a keyhole, wide and open. Not physical, metaphysical. You understood what it asked of you. Not an object, a memory. You closed your eyes and offered it the village, the ash, the silence, the child's toy left on a step, the bread left uneaten, the wooden idol Gaius had carried, the man who returned without his voice, the voice that sang from the well, the hollow that breathed. The stone pulsed once and opened. It did not swing inward. It did not rise. It simply ceased to be. Behind it, darkness, perfect, living, deep. You stepped forward. The light behind you narrowed, then faded. Ahead, a tunnel of stone, lined with carvings you could not read but somehow understood. They told the same story again and again, of something that fell, of something that waited, of those who remembered it, and of one who returned. You walked on, the walls breathing gently, the journal pressed to your chest, its pages now silent, and deep below the earth a new rhythm began to rise, not hostile, not welcome, but inevitable. The tunnel sloped downward with an almost imperceptible curve, guiding you like water through a carved channel. The air grew colder, not from wind or depth, but from a stillness so complete it pressed against your skin like a second cloak. Your boots made no sound. Even your breath seemed absorbed by the stone. The walls bore more than just spirals now. They were etched with shapes that bordered on the familiar. Arches, trees, suns, but none were complete. Each seemed caught mid-formation, as though the artist had been translating something glimpsed through water and remembered only in pieces. The farther you walked, the less these carvings looked like representations and more like instructions, as if they weren't telling you what had happened, but how to return. To what, you couldn't yet say. The passage narrowed, and for a moment, you walked sideways through a cleft barely wider than your shoulders. The stone was smooth and warm here, as though it had been touched often, worn down by generations of unseen hands. When the passage opened again, you had entered a new chamber, round, domed, with no walls visible beyond your immediate torchlight. The ceiling disappeared into darkness. The floor beneath you was stone, but inlaid with symbols, rings, triangles, interwoven lines. In the very center stood another basin, like the one in the hollow, but larger. Its edges were marked with symbols not carved but grown into the stone itself, like veins of root or bone. You approached it, and as you did, the torch in your hand flickered once, then stilled. The flame burned without movement, as though even fire had grown reverent here. The water in the basin was utterly black. You peered into it, and once more memory stirred, not yours, but something older. The surface rippled, and the vision came without warning. You saw the first stone fall, not from the sky, but from a place beyond sky. A silent motion, a descent not bound by weight or fire. It entered the world not as object, but as invitation. You saw people ancient, clothed in woven earth and ash, gathering around it. They did not fear it, they listened, and in return, it gave them structure, the spiral, the song, the rhythm of stillness. You saw the cities they built, not above the earth, but beneath it, wound into its folds, taught to breathe with it, doors that opened only when remembered, paths drawn not on maps, but in bloodlines. And then you saw the forgetting, the cities sealed, the songs lost, the stone hidden, not to imprison what lay beneath, but to protect it, to keep it sleeping. The water stilled again. You were no longer alone. Across the chamber at the far edge a figure stood, not cloaked in shadow, cloaked in silence, tall, unmoving, arms at its sides, no face, no eyes, but presence. You knew, without words, what it was. It had been watching, not just now, always. It stepped forward once, and the stone beneath your feet responded. The symbols lit, not with light, but memory. The path behind you sealed, the torch dimmed. The figure raised one hand, not in threat, in invitation. The spiral had turned. This was its center. You stepped forward. The figure did not move again. But the chamber changed. Walls pulled back. The ceiling rose. You were in a great hall now, carved not by men, but by purpose. Pillars lined either side, wrapped in carvings of those who had come before. Not warriors, not priests, witnesses. And at the end of the hall, a second door, smaller than the first, unmarked, plain, but you recognized it. You had seen it once before, in a dream half forgotten, the place Gaius had pointed to, where memory lived not in stone but in choice. You crossed the hall, slow and silent, each step a part of a pattern you hadn't known you were completing. The door opened without touch. Inside, darkness, complete and soft, like a room of breath held in waiting. And at the center, a single spiral, glowing faintly on the floor. You stepped into it. The darkness welcomed you like water, not drowning, returning. The spiral beneath your feet pulsed gently, not with light, but with memory. Each step further into the room was like walking deeper into something long buried. Not a place, not a tomb, but a moment. A moment stretched so wide it had become space itself. The darkness that surrounded you did not press or threaten. It simply was. And within it, the air carried sound, not voices, not language, breath, slow, ancient, rhythmic. It was not your own. You stepped into the center of the spiral. The floor beneath you shifted, not in motion but in state. One moment it was stone. The next, a surface so smooth and cold it defied texture. Beneath it, you saw not earth but sky, endless and black, pricked with stars that didn't twinkle, didn't move. They watched. And then the floor opened, not downward, outward. The spiral unfolded beneath you like a flower, each loop peeling back into strands of memory, lifting you gently as if on a breath too vast to measure. You did not fall. You were carried and then placed. You stood now in another chamber, but this one was not made of stone. It was made of time. The walls pulsed with scenes, visions not etched but living. You saw the rise and fall of places long forgotten, cities without names, voices without language, 1,000 kinds of silence. 1,000 spirals drawn in soil and ash and salt, all turning inward toward the place you now stood. At the center of this place hovered a shape, not solid, not light, formless, yet present. A spiral turning in slow, deliberate motion. It was not an object, it was an understanding, and it spoke to you, not in sound, in memory. You saw yourself, standing on the ridge, staring into the hollow, touching the stone in the forest, watching Gaius vanish into the dark, hearing the first whisper from the well. Every choice, every step folding into the spiral, not as consequence, but as offering. It showed you Lucullus, not lost, but transformed. His voice joined others, forming a rhythm, not a song, not a chant, a breath, a tide. He had stepped beyond knowing and become part of remembering. And then it showed you something else, a door, still unopened, not in stone, not in the world, but in you. You reached for it, it did not resist. Inside was not knowledge, but readiness. The spiral whispered once more, this time a name, not yours, its own. You could not speak it, could not hold it, but you understood it. It was not a creature, not a god. It was a rhythm, older than empire, older than stone, older than breath. It had not waited to be worshipped, only to be remembered, and you had remembered. The chamber pulsed gently. Around you the spiral turned inward, and with it, so did the memory. You felt yourself folding back, not in body, but in self. The spiral closed gently like a hand, and then you were standing in the outpost yard. At dawn, boots muddy, tunic damp but whole. No door behind you, no path, only silence, and 3 stones at your feet, arranged in a spiral. The morning sun rose over the outpost with a gentle indifference, casting long beams of gold across the courtyard. The gates were open. The smell of bread drifted faintly from the kitchen hearth. Somewhere in the stables a mule brayed, and the smithy's hammer rang once against cold iron. Life, or something that resembled it, carried on. And yet, nothing was the same. You stood where the spiral had left you, the 3 stones at your feet unmoving, quiet, as if they had always been there. They bore no carvings, no light, but they held weight, a different kind of weight, the kind felt not in the body, but in the memory. No one noticed your return. Not the sentries, not the cooks, not even the men who passed within arm's reach. Their eyes slid past you as though you were a shadow at the edge of flame, not unwelcome, not ignored, simply not seen. You moved through the outpost in silence, boots trailing dust, breath measured. The journal you had carried, Lucullus's, now yours, was no longer at your side. In its place, a faint pattern pressed into the inside of your palm, a spiral, shallow as a scar, traced in pale gray. You returned to your quarters. Your cot was untouched. Your things remained as you had left them. The cloak folded, the satchel hung, the basin half filled with yesterday's water, surface undisturbed. But on the wooden wall beside your bunk, someone or something had drawn a shape. A single, wide spiral, drawn in dust. No smearing, no dripping, just presence. You sat slowly and watched the light shift across the planks until the spiral faded back into the wall as the dust settled once more. That evening, the commander called an assembly. Not formal, not ordered. Men gathered in the yard because they felt something, not because they were told. And the commander, who had for weeks grown more pale, more quiet, stood on the steps beside the chapel, hands behind his back, eyes hollow with knowledge not easily spoken. "We are being relieved," he said. Murmurs passed through the crowd like smoke. "Relief patrols weren't expected for weeks," he continued. "Tribune Masala arrives in 2 days with 40 men, supplies, clerks, engineers." He paused. "They're calling this place a boundary post now, a watch station." You knew what that meant. The outpost had moved from map margin to memory margin. It had become a place not just of men, but of meaning. A place the Empire did not yet understand, but feared to forget. After the assembly, a young soldier approached you. You didn't know his name. He had arrived only days ago, fresh-faced, his armor polished like temple bronze. "Sir," he said, hesitating. You turned. "I found something," he said, "out past the old fence, in the grass." He held out his hand. In it, a small stone, black, smooth, flat. You didn't need to touch it to know. It was one of yours. He shifted. There were 3 in a circle, but when I reached them, the others were gone. You met his eyes, and for a moment he saw you, not the uniform, not the rank, you. He lowered the stone into your hand. "What is it?" he asked. You looked down at the spiral in your palm, then at the stone. "It remembers," you said. "That night, you did not sleep. Instead, you walked the perimeter beneath the moon that hung like a scar in the sky. You walked without destination, only direction. You followed the lines that no one else saw, the way the shadows bent, the way the trees leaned, the way the stones lined themselves quietly along forgotten roads. And at the edge of the outpost, near the ridge where you had first climbed with Lucullus, you found the basin again. Not of stone, of earth. A shallow depression, freshly formed, barely wider than your body. Inside, carved into the soil, was a new spiral. But this one was open, incomplete, waiting. You did not step into it, not yet. Instead, you knelt, pressed your fingers to the soil, and whispered a name you had never spoken aloud. Its name. And somewhere beneath the soil, the earth inhaled. The soil remained still beneath your touch, but you felt its breath, slow, patient, vast. Not wind, not weather, breath. The earth inhaled not with noise but with knowing, and for a long moment it held you in silence. The air above grew heavier, not oppressive but reverent, as if everything in the world paused to listen. The grass bent ever so slightly inward, drawn to the basin's edge, as though the land itself bowed in recognition. You stood and turned back toward the outpost, but now it felt distant, dimmed, as though your steps carried you further from men and closer to something else, not unseen, but long misunderstood. By the time you crossed the threshold of the palisade wall, the morning light was just breaking across the eastern sky, a faint gray line, thin and brittle, barely more than a suggestion. You walked past the outer barracks and into the narrow chapel, where no priest had served in weeks. Inside, the air smelled of dust and dry oil. The candles, though unlit, stood melted in shapes that curled like roots. At the altar, something waited. Not a presence, not a figure, but a mark, drawn faintly across the old wooden surface, the same broken spiral. You traced it with your finger, and where your skin touched the grain, it deepened, blackened like coal pressed into old lines. Not written by you, not meant for you, but recognized by you. Behind you, footsteps. You turned to find the commander. He looked older, not in body, but in bearing. He did not speak immediately, only walked to the edge of the room and placed something upon the altar beside your hand. A key, not to a door, not to a chest, a Roman command ring, iron set with a small obsidian stone. I'm leaving, he said quietly. With the others, Masala will be here before sunset. You looked at him, waiting. He met your gaze. I've seen it too, you nodded. I can't forget, he said, even when I sleep, especially when I sleep. Neither of you spoke of what it meant, what had been witnessed, what had been joined. He looked at the altar once more. She still sings, he whispered. You did not ask who. He stepped back, nodded once, and left. When the sun was fully risen, the new garrison arrived. 40 men, fresh uniforms, bronze polished, horses well fed, engineers with scrolls and stakes, clerks with wax tablets, an entire new order meant to overwrite what could not be erased. They didn't see you at first. You watched from the shade of the watchtower, cloak drawn, ring now tucked into your palm like a second spine. Tribune Masala took the chapel as his office. The basin near the ridge was marked on a map and dismissed as erosion. The spiral on the altar was scrubbed clean and replaced with the standard of Jupiter. But that night, as the stars emerged one by one in the brittle sky, the engineers found something beneath the southern wall. A layer of stone older than the outpost, cut into perfect arcs, a circle, and inside that circle, 3 stones, placed without mortar, without carving, arranged with the kind of care that only memory gives. Masala ordered the site filled in. Pagan nonsense, he said. But the next morning, it reappeared, uncovered by wind, by soil that shifted overnight without rainfall, unburied by intention. That day, one of the new clerks left a drawing on your bunk. You didn't know him, but he had seen it, a spiral, incomplete, waiting. That night, you returned to the basin. Not alone. Others waited there now. Some in silence, some kneeling, some only watching from the ridge, as though drawn by something they could not name. You stepped into the spiral, and the earth did not open, it welcomed. The ground beneath your feet did not shift, but the world around you did. The air, once brittle with starlight and silence, thickened into something deeper, less like atmosphere, more like water or smoke. The edges of the outpost, the trees, even the distant hills began to blur, their outlines growing soft like sketches left out in the rain. Time loosened its grip. The others who stood at the basin's edge did not speak. One knelt, head bowed, hands open as though awaiting something to be placed in them. Another traced patterns in the dust, spirals within spirals, drawn and redrawn until the earth absorbed the lines and breathed them back out again. You remained in the center of the basin, your boots resting inside the curved grooves of the open spiral. The ring on your finger grew cold, then warm, then weightless, as if sinking itself to something not external, but ancestral. From the ridge came a sound, not sharp, not sudden, a soft rhythm, like hands patting clay, like rain on stretched hide, like a chant without words or tone, only memory. And with it the night shifted again. The mist returned. It poured down the hill in a slow wave, not falling from the sky, but rising from the soil. It carried with it a scent both familiar and impossible. Smoke, stone, wet roots, distant thunder. Shapes moved within it, not human, not beast. Tall, still, like statues set into the moving fog. And the others felt them too. You saw it in their posture, in the way they straightened, breathed deeper, turned their faces without fear. One of them stood and walked forward, vanishing into the mist with a smile so faint it could have been memory itself. You did not follow, not yet. Instead, you knelt. You placed one hand upon the soil, and in that moment the spiral closed, not physically, not visibly, but within you. The open line that had wound through your days, your footsteps, your breath, it curled inward, found its center and settled. And in its place, stillness, not absence, presence. You saw again the faces, Gaius, Lucullus, the pale-eyed clerk. You saw the well, the second village, the dream of the door, the chamber where breath became stone and song became silence. And then you saw what lay beneath it all. Not a god, not a secret, but an understanding. A truth so old it had outlived language. The spiral is not a trap, it is a return. You stood slowly. The mist parted as you rose, and through it the shapes remained, watching, waiting, never approaching. You turned to the others. They watched you not as leader, not as soldier, as witness, as the one who had walked it fully. The ring on your finger glowed faintly. No flame, no magic, just memory. You walked from the basin without a word. The mist did not follow. The night grew quiet again, and the outpost when you returned felt smaller, not from shrinking, from knowing. You passed Masala in the courtyard. He did not speak. He watched you with cautious eyes and the stiff stance of a man who suspects the truth but cannot yet name it. In your bunk, the journal waited. Its pages were blank, not empty. You picked up a stylus, and for the first time your hand did not tremble. You began to write, not from thought, but from remembering. You wrote of circles, of silence, of song. And outside in the hills, the spiral turned once more. The days that followed passed without wind. Not calm, still. Even the usual movement of clouds above the outpost slowed, their edges fixed as if painted into the sky. The birds that once gathered at the well no longer came. The animals in nearby pastures stood quiet, eyes fixed toward the north ridge, as though listening for a sound they couldn't name. You continued your duties, though no one asked it of you. Patrols became habit more than obligation. The new garrison gave you space, their voices lowering when you passed. Even Masala, stern and disciplined, no longer summoned you. He received dispatches with his usual precision, barked orders at dusk, and yet glanced often toward the chapel, toward the basin, toward the spiral scratched into the stones near the gate. Some nights you found men sitting in the yard long after curfew, not in fear, in reflection, their hands idle, their eyes searching the sky. One soldier drew spirals in the dust with the hilt of his dagger, unaware he was doing so. Another stood motionless for hours near the wall, whispering a name too softly to hear. It was not a breakdown, it was a remembering, and it was spreading. The journal in your possession had begun to fill itself, or so it seemed. When you opened it each morning, new symbols had emerged. Not written, not drawn, emerged, pressed into the pages like watermarks from dreams. You recognized them all. They were not messages, they were markers, trail signs, the kind carved into trees by those who passed through wild places without leaving footprints. They marked a path. One evening, as the sun fell low behind the ridges, you followed it. You left the outpost behind without announcement, walked north through the low grasses and over the dry riverbed, past the old grove where birds once nested, past the cairn where Lucullus had once stood, though no stone marked his place. You followed the symbols carved in nothing, until you found the next door. It was not hidden. It stood in the center of a clearing, half buried in wildflowers and thin trees, its surface grown with moss but unbroken. A perfect circle of stone, embedded flat into the earth. No keyhole, no carving, only a faint shimmer in the dying light, like heat rising from cool stone. You knelt beside it, placed your hand on its surface, and felt once again that slow, familiar breath. This was not a descent, it was a return. You removed the ring from your finger, placed it gently in the center of the circle, and whispered nothing. The earth shifted, not outward, not downward, inward, as if it folded around you, and for a brief moment all sound ceased. Not silence, absence. Then, slowly, rhythm returned, your breath, the pulse, the hum beneath the soil. And then, another breath. Not yours. You opened your eyes. You stood not in a chamber, not in a tunnel, in a memory. It was night. The sky above unfamiliar, no constellations, no moon. Only a dim ring of stars turning slowly around a dark center. Below them, towers of stone, wide spirals of dwelling and hall carved into the hills like veins. You walked among them as one might walk among thoughts, recognizing things you had never known. Figures moved beside you. Tall, silent, robed in ash, not ghost, not God, memory. You felt no fear. You felt return, one step forward. Held out its hands. In its palms, a stone, black, smooth, spiral carved. You took it, and the stars above shifted, realigned, as though marking your place. The figure bowed its head, and the memory folded closed around you. Not with finality, with welcome. You awoke at the edge of the basin, the stone still in your hand, and in the distance from somewhere deep beneath the earth, the sound of breathing rose once more. You remained at the edge of the basin long after the sun rose. The stone in your hand was heavier than it looked, not in weight, but in memory. Its surface was smooth, impossibly so, and yet your fingers found the grooves of the spiral without looking. They had always known their path. You did not rush to return to the outpost. It no longer felt like leaving or arriving. The line between those two places, what lay behind and what lay within, had blurred until they were one. When you finally stood, the stone remained in your hand, and the ground beneath your feet felt firm yet gently pulsing. Not a tremor, not instability, a heartbeat. The earth had always been alive, but only now did it remember how to speak. You walked back slowly, passing through the trees that now leaned in familiar ways, their branches echoing the old shapes you'd seen beneath the ground. Birds watched in stillness. No calls, no flight, just presence. At the outpost, no alarm was raised. No gate was barred. The guards nodded once slowly, eyes flicking to the object in your hand before returning to their thoughts. One of them, a boy not older than 16, traced a spiral against the haft of his spear with his thumb, unconscious but precise. Masala waited at the chapel steps. He said nothing as you approached, but when your eyes met, something passed between you. Not understanding. Recognition. He stepped aside. You entered the chapel alone. Inside, the altar had been stripped of its imperial insignia. The statue of Jupiter had been removed. In its place, someone had carved a new pattern into the wood, faint but deliberate. A spiral with 4 arms, each pointing to a cardinal direction. At the center, a hollow. You placed the stone there. It fit without resistance, and the room exhaled. A faint breeze passed through, a breeze that had no source, no direction. It smelled of the hollow, of the well, of the ridge, of things remembered. Outside, you heard the sound of footsteps, dozens. You stepped back through the open doors and found the yard full. Every soldier, every clerk, even the cooks, the blacksmith, the mess runners. They had gathered, not by order, by instinct. You said nothing. You only raised your hand and pointed, not outward, not north or east, but downward, to the soil, to the basin, to the breath. They understood, and without instruction they moved, together. A slow procession toward the ridge, quiet and unhurried. They moved like pilgrims, like sleepers waking into dream, like memory made flesh. By the time the sun reached its peak, they stood in a wide circle around the basin, each one silent, each one waiting. You stepped into the center. The earth did not open, but it welcomed. The spiral reformed beneath your feet, slow and deliberate. The stone in the chapel pulsed faintly, sending tremors through the soil like ripples through water. And then for the last time, the breath returned. Deep, steady, inviting. You knelt, pressed both hands to the earth and remembered everything. The first village, the second door, the well, the watchers, the dream, the path. Gaius's silence, Lucullus's voice, the ring, the altar, the basin, the rhythm, the spiral, the presence beneath all things. And in that remembering, something opened. Not a gate, not a door, a way forward, a way inward. You stood and the others followed. One by one, they stepped into the spiral with you. Not to vanish, to continue, to carry the breath, the memory, the rhythm, to become the spiral walking. And as the sun dipped westward, the outpost behind you stilled, empty, but not abandoned. In the soil, in the stone, in the slow turn of shadow and root, something had returned. Not a legend, not a curse. A rhythm older than Rome, and it remembered your name.